Welcome everyone to the third in the speaker series this full semester, 2022. I want to welcome everyone to come listen to Jeanette McCarthy, who is currently Vice President of Precision Medicine at Fabric Genomics and founder of the Precision Medicine Advisors. Jeanette trained at UC Berkeley in genetic epidemiology. As you can see, she has both a master's in public health and a PhD, and spent the early part of her career in industry at Millennium Pharmaceuticals. She was a faculty member at Duke University, where she ran research programs on genetic underpinnings of complex diseases. She currently holds adjunct faculty positions at both UCSF and Duke University. And over the past decade, Jeanette has become a leading educator in the field of genomics and precision medicine, and has really become a key advisor to the genetic testing industry. In 2013, Jeanette founded Precision Medicine Advisors, as you see on the screen in front of you, which is an education and consulting business focused on communicating genomics to non-technical audiences, including healthcare providers, patients, and other stakeholders. And Jeanette has created over the years many important materials for teaching. Some of them are free on the web. Some you'll find on Coursera. She's developed magazines for this and has really focused on trying to disseminate the information. Jeanette has worked with Fabric Genomics since 2013 on the development of software for genome analysis and variant interpretation, and currently leads clinical services and product and customer success. She's also co-author of a book, Precision Medicine, A Guide to Genomics and Clinical Practice, which I'm sure would be a great read. I was really excited to have Jeanette come speak here today. We had a great chat before this about the challenges, and I think it's now well recognized that one of the major barriers to actual implementation of precision medicine is actually the need for education and understanding at many levels, including the healthcare system and the patients. There are many areas, such as in oncology, where we clearly now have tools for precision medicine, but they are clearly underutilized, which represents a missed opportunity, not only for our healthcare system, but also for our patients. And Jeanette is going to touch on some of these. Thus, I think we're all going to be excited to hear Jeanette's vision on a practical approach to precision medicine education. Thanks, Jeanette.
Great. Thanks, Adrian. Thank you so much for inviting me here to talk about a topic that I'm very passionate about, which is precision medicine education. Today, what I wanted to do was share a little data on the utilization of precision medicine and address some of the healthcare provider skepticism around it. And then I'd like to share a pragmatic approach for educating healthcare providers that really aims to improve genomic literacy and instill practical skills for integrating genetic testing into patient care. And I want to make a couple of apologies up front. One is that precision medicine obviously encompasses more than genetic testing. It encompasses other modalities of testing. It encompasses tailored treatments, but I will typically refer to genetic testing in my talk when I say precision medicine. And then the second thing is I recognize the need to educate across the healthcare provider spectrum, but sometimes I'll slip in and say physician education, so I apologize. I do believe that education across the spectrum of healthcare providers is important. So with that, let me get started. I know that you all are well aware that genetic testing is now available across the lifespan. Most people are probably familiar with testing programs that have been around for many years, including preconception carrier testing for diseases like sickle cell anemia and cystic fibrosis, prenatal testing for chromosomal abnormalities, and the mandatory newborn screening that is state mandated in the US. What people might not be as familiar with are some of the newer areas that have really taken off, especially in the last few years. And these include diagnostic testing for rare diseases. We think of this mostly in terms of children with rare genetic diseases, but it's also currently being used in the neonatal intensive care unit to help diagnose NICU patients. And also in adults, we often forget that adults can also suffer from genetic diseases that might present as diagnostic odysseys. Pharmacogenomics is an area that is referred to by some as precision medicine for everyone, because just about everybody has a pharmacogene that may impact their response to a commonly prescribed drug. And then in the area of oncology, there's two use cases mostly, which is predisposition testing for hereditary cancer syndromes, and then among cancer patients, tumor profiling to determine the appropriate treatment. And something that you hear about more and more is healthy screening. So screening cohorts of members of a healthcare organization, for example, who are ostensibly healthy, to see if they have any genetic variation that might impact their health. So these are the different tests that are currently available. And yet, if you look at the integration of precision medicine into healthcare systems, we still have a long way to go. This is a study that came out in 2021, which surveyed 153 US-based academic health systems, community health systems, and integrated delivery networks about their integration of precision medicine into healthcare. And they looked at the integration of 5 main areas: oncology, prenatal neonatal screening, pharmacogenomics and chronic disease, rare and undiagnosed disease, and healthy screening. And what they found is, first of all, they evaluated each of the institutions on a quantitative scale, which considered institutional testing guidance, leadership at the institution, funding from the institution, data utilization, data sharing. And they came up with this quantitative scale and basically found that precision medicine approaches are often used only at a very basic level and are typically not supported by the organization. There's very little C-suite endorsement or support for precision medicine. Instead, it usually penetrates only certain departments with maybe a subset of the tests that are available and are really driven by physician leaders. So the underutilization of precision medicine can lead to overall higher costs compared to when people use precision medicine or genetic testing. And in this example here, based on a data set from Optum Healthcare, which looked at over 12,000 patients 0 to 18 years old, it showed that there was actually higher utilization of intensive care services when patients were not tested. So in this study, they asked how many patients in this database had clinical indicators of genetic disease who could have benefited from genetic testing, and in this case, benefited from either single gene testing or whole genome, whole exome sequencing. And they found that 9.4% of their pediatric patients had clinical indicators of genetic disease. 44% of their NICU patients had clinical indicators of genetic disease. And yet only a fraction of those patients had any genetic testing done. Those that did have genetic testing done, the average time to their first genetic test was unacceptably long, sometimes a year on average. So again, the lack of use, the underutilization in this study led to overall higher costs and higher utilization of services. Another example that was just published recently in Journal of Clinical Oncology showed the practice gaps related to using tumor profiling for non-small cell lung carcinoma. And in this study, they found that 64% of advanced patients diagnosed in 2019 did not benefit from targeted therapies. In other words, they were not offered the test, or the test was not utilized to change management in a way that it could have. And it outlined what some of those reasons were as well. About 23% of those cases were not able to be tested because there was no insufficient sample or no sample was taken to be able to do the testing in the first place. 18% of them had issues with the test ordering. Either the appropriate test was not ordered or the treatment began before the testing was ordered, so there was no point in it in the end. About 22% of the cases that were lost to testing were because the test performance was not good enough. In other words, there were inconclusive or false negative results, or the turnaround time was so long that treatment started before the results were returned. And then Interestingly, about 29% of these cases were lost because targeted treatment was not selected despite positive test results. And I'm not sure exactly why that was the case, but this whole study actually points to a need for educating physicians and other healthcare providers about this field and how to utilize it in practice. So it's not just the underutilization of precision medicine, but it's also the inappropriate use or inappropriate test ordering, as shown in this study here. This was a study conducted at Stanford Healthcare several years ago, and it showed that 13% of tests were actually misorders. And this resulted in patient anxiety, failures or delays in appropriate care, and a financial burden. Some of the misorders are noted in the table here, and they include simple things like clerical errors, the wrong test order was placed by mistake, redundant testing, where the current test order provides the same information or overlapping information with a concurrent or prior genetic test. The biggest category of misorders, though, were controversial misorders. About 50% of them were controversial, where there was either scarce or no scientific data on the test's clinical utility. And these were the types of tests that were ordered. So in the end, they were probably not the best choices. So all of this points to the need for precision medicine education. And I was at a conference recently at Illumina where the idea that healthcare providers need education permeated the conference. Every talk that I went to, it came down to the need for precision medicine education, not just of healthcare providers, but patients as well. So we already know that increased uptake of precision medicine can improve patient care through accurate diagnosis, better management, improved treatment outcomes, and prevention of disease. But I think we spend maybe too much time focused on increasing uptake, where we should be focused on appropriate use of precision medicine, because appropriate use can not only improve patient care, but can also reduce wasteful spending. So I had the opportunity when I was at UCSF to develop some courses around precision medicine. And prior to developing this course, we gave a survey to the primary care physicians at UCSF, asking them about their interest in receiving education on precision medicine. And their responses were very telling. One of the physicians said, "It's very unclear to me that this should be even in the top 25 topics in primary care. I see the value in oncology and advancing knowledge, but what else?" This really highlights that many healthcare providers might not even be aware of what types of genetic tests are out there. What are the clinical applications? Another physician said, "I don't see this as a viable primary care topic for at least a couple of more years. These issues really require specialty expertise." So this response actually makes sense to me, because when you think about genetic testing historically, it's been in the domain of genetics professionals, genetic counselors, and medical geneticists. But when you think about the current state of genetic testing, it really does span all of healthcare. And given that there are fewer than 6,000 genetic counselors, which means one for every about 150 physicians, and fewer than 1,500 medical geneticists, continuing with this model of using genetics professionals whenever we require genetic testing is just not sustainable, even with telemedicine. And so I do firmly believe that precision medicine is a primary care issue. Some of the examples shown here directly live in the primary care space. For example, hereditary cancer and cardiovascular testing. Primary care physicians are already taking family histories, so it's a logical next step to try and recognize when a family history could indicate a genetic disorder like a hereditary cancer or cardiovascular disease, for which genetic testing could help. Pharmacogenomics, as I mentioned earlier, precision medicine for everyone. There are a number of different pharmacogenetic tests that are out there that could benefit patients, and this is definitely something seen in the primary care setting. I think the more interesting one is consumer genomics. With the rise of direct-to-consumer genetic testing, physicians are increasingly seeing their patients come to them with results from these tests and asking for their advice or to have them help explain the results. And then even in the rare undiagnosed disease space, although once you decide to undergo genetic testing, or if you have a child, for example, with a quite serious genetic disorder, maybe they are under the care of a medical geneticist. But before then, recognizing when you have a patient, whether it's a pediatric patient or an adult patient with some diagnostic dilemma who could benefit from genetic testing, that is squarely in the space of primary care. So next, I'd like to address some of the healthcare provider concerns about precision medicine. Again, the same survey I did with UCSF gave me a couple of other pieces of information that led me to believe that healthcare providers are really skeptical about precision medicine. One of the comments, I don't and shouldn't adopt any new technology, test, or therapy until patient-centered improvements in outcomes are demonstrated. And until that randomized controlled data is available, I'm going to tune this out. And another physician said, someone should spearhead an initiative that would gather input from experts about the importance value of genomic information and how money spent on this topic depletes the medical commons without data for justification. So there's quite a bit of skepticism out there, and maybe even a feeling that the excitement around genomic and precision medicine really is disproportionate to the value that has been demonstrated to physicians. And this is understandable because from what I see, the usual sources of truth that healthcare providers might turn to might not be so useful for precision medicine at this time. And I wanted to give 3 examples of this. One is related to professional guidelines and how sometimes they lag behind the available evidence. The second is looking at the drug label, and this is specifically for pharmacogenomics, and how inconsistent application of pharmacogenomic information in that label can cause some confusion. And the final area is a lack of regulation and how the approval of genetic tests, for example, from 23andMe, can lead to misinterpretation of the value of those tests. So the first one is related to cancer testing guidelines here. So testing guidelines for many genetic tests don't even exist, but the NCCN has done quite a good job, at least producing guidelines to help healthcare providers decide when to order a genetic test. But a recent study has shown that these testing guidelines might miss the mark. Genetic testing guidelines for hereditary cancer syndromes typically endorse genetic testing for patients who already have cancer. Actually, just as a sidebar, my mentor, Mary Claire King, wrote an op-ed once that said, identifying cancer patients with a genetic test after they already have cancer is a failure of public health, because the real value of these hereditary cancer tests is identifying patients before they get cancer so that you can help to prevent it. And in this study here, although the guidelines, they endorse testing of people who already have cancer, they endorse testing in people who have a strong family history. What this study found was that 50% of individuals with pathogenic variants in one of these cancer genes would not have been detected if they had followed just these guidelines. So 50% of patients actually don't have a family history for one reason or another. This finding highlights the limitations of using these clinical guidelines to make decisions about genetic testing in this specific use case. And it's very consistent with what has been shown in other studies. Another area where our sort of truth set falls apart is in pharmacogenomics. So with pharmacogenomics, there are two issues. One is related to, again, maybe a lack of guidelines, where if you look at the approximately 150 pharmacogenomic gene drug pairs, so there are about 150 tests out there that have reasonable clinical validity. You can see in the blue bar, in the blue part of the pie chart there, that there are no guidelines available for any of these. There are professional guidelines for a very small subset of these. There are other guidelines from CPIC, which is the Clinical Pharmacogenomics Implementation Consortium, that are available for a subset of these pharmacogenetic markers. And CPIC is a great organization. They've developed guidelines, they've done literature reviews, they've looked at the clinical validity of tests, they've made recommendations for what information should be accompany those test results, but they're not, this organization is not recognized by the FDA as sort of a valid source of clinical information. So there are relatively few guidelines for the number of tests that are out there. But I think the real problem that we see is in the drug label. I wanted to speak a little bit about the FDA-approved drug labels for drugs for which there's a pharmacogenomic marker available. Some of these, well, actually very few of them require or recommend pharmacogenomic testing, even though there are good pharmacogenomic tests out there. And the language that they put in these labels is not very prescriptive. Here's an excerpt from the drug label from azathioprine, for which there's a side effect myelosuppression related to TPMT genotype. And this label simply states that it is recommended that consideration be given to either genotype or phenotype patients for TPMT. And it doesn't really say much more than that. So this is not very prescriptive and does not give a physician a lot to go on in terms of what they should be doing with these patients. There was a study that came out a few years ago, which really intrigued me, which talked about the FDA's approach to putting pharmacogenomic information in the drug label. It was very telling. So basically they really tried to balance the need to communicate important information without being too prescriptive. And part of this is related to the fact that there isn't always a lot of strong evidence, prospective clinical trials to support these markers, but also there weren't, at least when these labels came out with pharmacogenomic information, there weren't a lot of tests available, at least not FDA-approved tests. And so they were kind of hedging their bets in terms of the language that they put in the label. If you look at the drug labels that currently have pharmacogenomic information, only about a third of them have demonstrated evidence of clinical validity. So that's one thing. And the converse is also true. There are a number of pharmacogenomic markers out there that do have good clinical validity, but that information doesn't make it into the drug label. So a mention in the FDA drug label does not imply clinical validity or utility of a pharmacogenomic test, and lack of it does not mean that there isn't an important pharmacogenomic marker out there. So the last source of truth that does not really sort of stand up to the test of scrutiny is FDA regulation of genetic tests. So regulation of genetic tests is really handled by CMS. CMS oversees clinical laboratories and they really oversee the analytical validity of tests. How well does the laboratory assay detect that analyte? They don't really regulate further downstream interpretation of those cases, of those tests or anything else. The FDA typically regulates medical devices, and although it has the ability or authority, presumably, to regulate genetic tests, it has not done so. Most genetic tests are run as laboratory developed tests, and as such, they only need to have this be run in a CLIA lab in order to be able to offer these tests. Now, there was some legislation that was introduced several years ago called the VALID Act, which was basically an outline for how the FDA should and would regulate genetic tests going forward. And although this was introduced in 2018, it has still been floating around Congress, still has not been passed. I know it was up for review recently and for some reason did not get enacted. But I bring this up because a lot of times when we think about FDA regulation of tests, we think that if the FDA regulates it, it's going to make it safer. But I want to point out an example of where I think FDA regulation does not necessarily make a safer or more effective product. And the example here is with 23andMe. So 23andMe, direct-to-consumer genetic testing company, back in, I think it was 2013, a bunch of companies started offering genetic tests direct to consumers, and the FDA was a little distraught over this. And so it basically told them all they have to stop doing that. They have to get FDA approval or stop. And many of those companies just stopped. Others brought physicians on board to make it look like they were ordering them through the physician. But 23andMe actually went the distance and went through and got FDA approval for their genetic test. So one of the tests that they offer is for hereditary breast cancer. And their test actually looks at two genes, BRCA1 and BRCA2, and they report out on 3 known pathogenic variants. They happen to be the most common founder variants, but they only report out on 3 genetic variants. And for those of you who've done hereditary cancer testing, you know that there are thousands of known pathogenic variants in these 2 genes. And most, if not all, of the genetic tests out there now do sequencing to be able to identify any of those thousands of pathogenic variants. But the FDA approved 23andMe's test with only 3 variants on it. They also required them to state that these tests should not be used as diagnostic tests or to make medical decisions. But then I wonder why they actually FDA approved them if they weren't supposed to be used in this way. But my point is that slapping the FDA seal of approval on this test could give this false perception that these tests are safe and good. And so when I think about FDA regulation of genetic tests, I'm not so sure that they will make this field, make testing safer or more effective. And I really think it can do a disservice in this case. So with all of this, it's no wonder that there's a lot of skepticism out there from healthcare providers about precision medicine. Not only is there skepticism, but I think there's a lot of fear or lack of confidence in healthcare providers' own knowledge about key areas of genetics. This is a survey, it's actually quite old, but I would be surprised if the data has changed much, even in the last 10 years. This was a survey of primary care physicians from the American College of Physicians. And you can see in the survey that most physicians were not confident in their understanding of basic genetic principles, indications for testing, and things like that. They also were not confident in having skills to be able to find guidelines, for example, or incorporate genetic testing into practice. So there's a skepticism, there's a lack of confidence, and again, all of this points to a need to educate healthcare providers in this field. Fortunately, over the last 10 years or so, a lot of different programs have been developed across undergrad and graduate medical education. There was a nice paper that was published in 2018, which talked about all of the different organizations and what types of approaches they were taking. And you can see on this list here, for example, for undergraduate medical education, there's some really innovative approaches that have been taken, which include personal genome sequencing, pharmacogenomic testing, sort of this hands-on get yourself sequenced or genotyped and see how you would interpret it, cadaver exome sequencing and things like that. For graduate medical education, special conferences, workshops, doing cross-specialty training, all of these things have been pretty innovative and have hoped to move the needle in terms of education. When it comes to continuing medical education, we've seen an increase in websites that have resources available, genomics education portals. Some institutions have physician buddy systems and other approaches, including some online courses. So I wanted to talk a little bit about an online course that I had developed with Bob Nussbaum at UCSF back in 2014. And we offered this course through Coursera. Coursera courses are, even though they're online, they're not on demand. You typically offer them at a given time. And so it kind of concentrates, makes people focus that they have to complete this course during the certain time period that it's available. The first time that we offered this course was spring of 2014. The course was really designed for healthcare providers and included 7 one-hour lectures plus a brief assessment, and it also carried some CME. The course was modular, which allowed students to skip over sections where they felt like they already had competence in. The 7 one-hour lectures covered some basic principles of human genomics, methods of genetic association, but then the rest of the lectures all focused on clinical applications. We focused on prenatal and carrier testing and newborn screening, the use of next-gen sequencing for solving diagnostic dilemmas, predictive testing for common complex diseases, pharmacogenomics, and tumor profiling. And we not only had these lectures recorded, but we also had some exercises, quizzes, and a discussion forum. The first time we offered the course in spring of 2014, we had 13,000 students sign up. I was really excited about this. What I'm not showing here is that many of these students dropped out before the end of the course, which was a little disappointing, but from what I hear, that's pretty common with Coursera courses or any online learning. Nonetheless, what we found was from a subset of those students who completed the survey, students were coming from all over the world. Only about 1/3 of them were from the US. And about 1/4 of those who answered the survey were involved in patient care. We offered the course again 1 year later in the spring of 2015, and we got a little over 7,000 students enrolled, and similarly, about 1/3 from the US and the rest from all over the world. We had the opportunity with all of these students to do some surveys, and didn't have a great response on the surveys, but we did get some data. We were able to ask them if they ever had ordered a genomic test of any kind, and you can see that about half of them had never ordered a genetic test. How often had a patient initiated a request for a test by name? About half of the time, the physicians initiated. And then how often had a patient presented genetic results to you for interpretation that you did not order? And again, about half of the patients had done that, or half of the physicians noted having a patient do that. So we could get some pretty reasonable information from these surveys here. One of the most interesting things that I found was when we asked, which of the following do you perceive as a major barrier to obtaining genomic testing for your patients? I was certain they were going to answer education, lack of education, but no, their biggest concern or biggest barrier was cost and insurance coverage. So that's sort of surprised me. But then when I went back to the survey that I had done with UCSF healthcare providers, I pulled out this quote from one of the physicians at UCSF that said one of their biggest concerns was how to get insurance authorization for such tests. Since we can't seem to get authorization for even single gene tests for most patients, there's not much utility for further training on genomic medicine until that issue is solved. So with that, I really spent some time thinking about a pragmatic approach to precision medicine education. I know education within the undergraduate and graduate medical school curriculum has changed over the years, but in some of the experience that I had at UCSF and at Duke, I found that the genetics education was, the content was dense, detailed, and overly complex, and was already crammed into an already crowded curriculum offered early in training, and not always including some of the current applications of precision medicine. So I spent a lot of time thinking about precision medicine education and came up with this analogy which sort of encapsulates my philosophy on precision medicine education. I think about it in terms of when you want to be able to drive a car, right? You don't need to be an auto mechanic to drive a car. You need some driver's education. So you go and you either take a class, if you're in high school, for example, take a formal course, or you just get the materials and study them yourself. You have a hands-on component behind the wheel. If something happens and you need to know how to change your tire, for example, you have an owner's manual that you can refer to. And if there's something that you need to do, for example, get your oil changed, although you might be able to do it yourself, maybe you don't have time or you don't have confidence, you can always go to someplace like Jiffy Lube and they'll do that for you. And so I think about precision medicine education kind of using this analogy, and how there are really these three pillars. One is giving healthcare providers some basic genomic literacy and training, giving them some hands-on experience, providing them with resources that they can go to and easily access to be able to answer questions, and then providing them some support in case they don't want to or aren't able to provide some of these services themselves. When you go to driving school, you learn practical stuff. You learn how to go about roundabouts. You learn how to parallel park. You learn how to merge in and out of traffic. You learn how to share the road with animal-drawn vehicles. What you don't learn when you're studying to get your driver's license is, what is a camshaft or a carburetor or gaskets or pistons. That's just not even in the vocabulary of driving school. Similarly, I feel that precision medicine education needs to focus on the practical stuff. And that practical stuff includes who, when, what, where, and how to order genetic tests, how to interpret and use results to manage patients, how to explain the benefits, limitations, and results to your patients. In terms of who to test, use the hereditary cancer as an example. It's really understanding that if I'm testing an affected patient, that's diagnostic testing, and what are the benefits and risks of that? If I'm testing high-risk unaffected individuals in a predisposition setting, what are the benefits and risks? And what are the benefits and risks to testing in the general population as a screening test? And on top of that, really understanding, if I'm going to order this test for this different use case, is insurance going to cover it or not? In terms of which test to order, I feel like this is probably the biggest challenge right now for any healthcare provider, because according to the study that came out a few years ago, there are over 75,000 active genetic testing units on the market. They span a number of different areas, but the tests are coming from all of these different labs, and even within a specific lab, they might offer slightly different gene panels, a large gene panel, a small gene panel, one that's more focused, one that's more broad. And so it can be really confusing thinking about which test to order, which lab, which test, and what the benefit is. There are some catalogs out there of genetic tests. There's the Genetic Testing Registry. There's also a website from Concert Genetics where you can pull up different tests and compare them across different labs in terms of what genes are on those panels, for example. But the other issue that's much more difficult to get at is that there's variable quality in these different tests. So I already mentioned the example of 23andMe, where they're only looking at 3 genetic variants out of the thousands that exist. If you look at, here's a study from 2018 that looked at the genes that were included, the top 30 breast ovarian cancer panel genes. So they looked across all of these tests that were offered for hereditary breast and ovarian cancer, looked at the top 30 genes there, and asked the question about how clinically valid those genes were. And what you see here is that about a third of the cancer panel genes actually had insufficient evidence of association with disease. And so if you were to find a pathogenic variant in one of these genes, it wouldn't necessarily be very clear what you would tell your patient to do. The other thing is that many of the genetic tests detect single nucleotide variants, which are the most common type of variant, but it's increasingly being recognized that copy number variants can contribute to disease as well. And some tests offer copy number variant detection while others don't. So it's really sort of challenging to understand which test you should actually be ordering. Similarly, it's important to be able to understand a laboratory report. And the issue we face here is if you look across different laboratories, there's wide variability in laboratory reports. Not all of them are geared towards physicians or patients. They often include very technical language. I think for precision medicine education, part of that education needs to be understanding the vocabulary of a laboratory report. Until lab reports are more standardized or simplified, this is an unfortunate reality. And here are some of the terms shown on this slide that you typically find on a lab report. Management guidelines, so the importance of being able to tell your patients what they should do, or having physicians know what they should do for patients who have a specific genetic variant. Management guidelines do exist in a number of places. Some of the better genetic test reports actually include those management guidelines in the report, so that's very useful, but not all of them do. Physicians should know about resources that are out there like gene reviews, GTRX for rare diseases, the genetic testing registry, Medline Plus. These are all great sources of information for getting management guidelines that you can share. I'm beginning to believe more and more that institutions, healthcare organizations, really need to take it upon themselves to bring some resources in-house to support their physicians and other healthcare providers who want to order genetic tests. Healthcare organizations would benefit from resource libraries that include very clear indications for testing across different therapeutic areas. Reimbursement guidelines. I know many of the genetic testing companies offer resources, deep resources for what's covered and what's not, and even some of the forms that you need for medical necessity letters, things like that. But if healthcare organizations who are offering genetic testing or supporting their healthcare providers for genetic testing, if they had reimbursement guidelines easily available, management guidelines available, that would be really helpful. The other thing is, I mentioned how difficult it is to select a genetic test. If a healthcare organization did that work upfront across different therapeutic areas, evaluating the validity of these different tests, evaluating how well their clinical report explained the results, and maybe came up with some recommendations for their healthcare providers, I think that would go a long way. And then the other thing to consider is bringing testing in-house. It's not unreasonable to think that in your own hospital laboratory that you could bring genetic testing in-house. And there are several benefits to this, including managing and controlling the utilization of these tests, controlling costs, and also the ability to generate custom reports where you can actually put the information on there that you want. I feel like formal education in precision medicine should really be centered around use cases, all of the therapeutic areas that I just talked about where genetic testing is making an impact. It should focus on some basic genomic literacy, which should not be dumbed down, but rather stripped down. When I teach genetics to healthcare providers, I never mention that DNA is a double-stranded molecule comprised of a sugar, a phosphate, and a base. That's irrelevant. And yet I find that many of the genetics programs in teaching medical students are taught by geneticists who tend to throw around all of this jargon and very detailed information that's really just not needed. So I would advocate for a stripped down version of genomic literacy. Practical skills are super important, as we saw in the survey of healthcare providers, knowing how to find a test, knowing how to interpret the test, and really this combination of didactic and hands-on, I think, will move the field forward. I wanted to mention a couple of things that I've done over the years. Adrian mentioned the Precision Medicine Academy. The Coursera course that I had put together was offered on Coursera for a couple of years, and then UCSF stopped supporting it. So it's no longer available. It has not been available for many years now. And so instead, I've developed my own courses on my Precision Medicine Academy. These are all online courses that were developed really kind of mirroring what I did for Coursera. These are all freely available online. It covers some basic genomic literacy in the Essential Precision Medicine course. Some of the risks, benefits, and validity of testing, covers regulation, reimbursement. And then I focus on the main clinical applications: sequencing for rare disease, pharmacogenomics, tumor molecular profiling, and hereditary cancer. These are all courses, but when I say course, they're mini courses. They're about an hour or so, and contain some pretty decent content aimed at practical skills and genomic literacy. The other thing that I found super effective are hands-on workshops. I was convinced that physicians from around the world would be flocking to take these online courses. And although I've had a lot of uptake, I find that healthcare providers are not necessarily interested in sitting down at a computer and going over all these courses on their own. And I've had much more success doing hands-on workshops, 1 to 2 day workshops, very focused on some specific applications of precision medicine, incorporating personal genomic testing, reviewing actual test reports, role-playing, patient discussions. So I've had a lot of fun with these. Just like when you have a car, you want to take it to Jiffy Lube to get your oil changed, I think that every healthcare provider needs to know where to go to get help if they want. And obviously, genetic counselors are a great resource. They can review family medical history, take informed consent, order tests, review and explain the results. And I would recommend that any hospital or healthcare system equip themselves with a number of genetic counselors who could act as a resource for physicians, as well as developing a resource center for guidelines, insurance coverage, things like that. It's also been very helpful in some organizations to have healthcare provider champions, as well as peer-to-peer consulting. So I think there's a lot that healthcare organizations can do to sort of support their healthcare providers in terms of precision medicine education. There's also, I have Genome Medical's logo on here, right? They have a lot of genetic counselors and other genetics professionals who can also help out for organizations that don't have those resources internally. And finally, I know Adrian already mentioned the book that I co-authored with my colleague, Bryce Mendelson, medical geneticist. This is actually a few years out of date right now, but the general principles are the same. It's due for a new version, but it's really a very practical guide to precision medicine, provides, again, some of the basic genomic literacy, vocabulary, and also on a use case by use case basis outlines how to implement genetic testing into practice. So in summary, The development of precision medicine education for healthcare systems, I think, need to be developed around these major clinical applications and focused on very practical aspects of delivery. Programs that provide opportunities for interactive hands-on experience, including personal genetic testing for trainees, have been shown to be very successful. Creating resource libraries that lower the barrier to testing by providing guidelines, insurance coverage, and other documents in digestible formats would also be helpful. I think one of the biggest areas that healthcare organization could make an impact is in helping to recommend the best tests that could be used for each application. Alternatively, bring genetic testing in-house, and then providing internal support, including genetic counseling, physician champions, and peer-to-peer fora for Q&A, grand rounds, things like that are super helpful as well. So I'm going to go ahead and stop there so I can leave a few minutes for questions. And thank you very much.
Thank you, Jeanette. I will clap you from everyone who's online. That was absolutely fantastic. You are such a great, clear and simple speaker, and I'm sure educator as well. I should say, for those online, Jeanette is also on a podcast, the Precision Medicine podcast, and has some really nice podcasts on there explaining, where she explains pharmacogenomics and many of those other areas. Mm-hmm. So we will open it up for questions from anyone. We will, I think Jenny's going to unmute everyone. I would just ask one quickly out of the chat first, Jeanette. There's a question about the delayed testing that you showed in the introduction, which I think was in the Pete's NICU example.
Yeah.
Do you know if that delayed testing was from a lack of knowledge of genetic testing or an intentional delay based on costs and logistics?
Yeah, I don't think that they were able to determine that, because that study really just looked at data from Optum Health. It wasn't sort of a survey of the physicians, for example. So I'm not sure that they could even get at that, but that's a great question.
And I have a quick question for myself. I'll take one. You talked about the misuse of tests.
Yeah.
And because there's scarce or no data. And then also about skepticism, which comes from that lack of data as well. And you quoted a physician that said they need RCT data and patient outcomes. Obviously, in precision medicine, RCT data is extremely difficult to get if everyone is individual. That doesn't really fit with an RCT. So how do you think we get to getting that data? And I know that's maybe not part of your talk on education, but what do you think? You must have heard others speak about this. How do you close that gap then? Yeah,
that is really a tough nut to crack. I mean, you hear people talk about these N-of-1 trials sometimes. I understand the skepticism and the need for this data, but I really feel like in this case, there may be an exception, because what we're talking about is taking, for example, a disease area and slicing and dicing it now. Think about rare genetic diseases. How are you ever going to do a trial showing that for any of those diseases that there's clinical validity or utility? You know, you can think about it in aggregate, but I'm just not sure. And yeah, I'm not sure how to generate that data without real world evidence. You know, you hear a lot of people talking about just using real world evidence out there.
Yeah, perhaps that's the answer.
Yeah.
Okay, any questions from anyone else?
I have a question.
Yeah, Malabika.
Yes, thank you for the wonderful talk. So my question is, you touched on FDA approval and regulatory implications. So what are the primary regulatory challenges for the development and implementation of precision medicine that have been identified?
So I think the regulatory challenges are going to be around that same issue of having the appropriate data, the randomized controlled trials. You know, I think the bigger challenge now is maybe the lack of regulation kind of leads to the Wild West of genetic testing out there. I mean, I've seen things in my role at Fabric, even working with a number of different labs who, run the gamut from the most pristine test that tests for absolutely everything. It's the highest quality ever to those that maybe have less quality, and they're all out there and nobody knows the difference between these tests, right? It just takes, it's really difficult to discern good tests from bad tests. Everything's out there, nothing's regulated. I don't know that regulation is the answer, because I don't think that that necessarily makes things safer or better. But it's the industry is definitely bracing for FDA to come in and start regulating soon.
Thank you.
Fantastic. Any other questions? If not, then Jeanette, I'd like to thank you for your talk. That was fantastic, highly educational. I'm sure people are going to take it away and then try and think about how they're going to teach precision medicine as well. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much.
Bye.
Bye.